Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I have a great guest today, uh, Damian. Now, see, I'm going to mess up your. I've got a mental block now.
No worries. De Virgilio. De
De
Virgilio.
Virgilio, yeah. Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here with a very special guest with a great story, Damian De Virgilio. So, welcome, Damian. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor, and thank you for all you do with this, with your blog and the podcast. It's amazing. It's great.
Thanks. Yeah, it's certainly been a lot of fun, and especially talking to guests like you who have, a really story that I've never heard of before, and I'm sure a lot of other people. But before we get into that, when did your family come to the States?
So I am actually a rather recent immigrant story compared to many others with Italian ancestry. My parents only came to the States in the 70s, in the 1970s. Both my parents are from Orfetta in the province of Bari in Puglia. I know you have Bari roots as well. And they came here after, in the mid 60s when the quotas were lifted. Immigration laws were changed, which then allowed, the laws that had been in place since the early 1920s, there was another major wave of Italian immigrants in the 60s. And my father in particular already had family here who'd been trickling over since the mid 50s. You know how it was, that chain, one representing somebody else, someone in the family advocating for someone else. And he came here in 1970, but went back and married my mother in 73. And then he brought her over. And my sister and I were born here in the States.
Oh, so that's really interesting. I didn't realize that. I knew you were recent, but I didn't realize it was that recent. Was there reasons other than the family being here that they decided to come?
Well, a lot of it was economics. In the 1960s, in particular, Italy faced a major recession. My father was a farmer in Italy. He and his mother worked on a rented farm, and things were tough. And they had family here in the States, and who kept telling them, come over, and they fought, I think, that choice for some time. And then my grandmother came first in 69. She arrived, interestingly enough, on Thanksgiving Day, 69. And my father was here 6 months later. And the interesting part is, I have to often acknowledge my dad in the sense that here he is, he was 32 at the time. And, he tried different types of work and became an electrician of all things after being a farmer for much of his life. But it was mainly economics. That's what really brought them here. Opportunity, like with every immigrant group, most immigrants.
Wow, that's really an awesome story. I know you listen to some of my podcasts, so you probably know that my uncle was left behind in Bari with his great grandparents, and he didn't come over until the 50s and had to spend 5 years in Canada with his family. And even though his four brothers served in World War II, it didn't matter.
Yeah, the stories you hear about people and the choices they had to make, the sacrifices that they made, that's what compels us, I think, to explore our own family history and the family history of others, because there's a lot to learn from those stories.
Yeah, no, definitely. So now, have you gone to the hometown?
As often as I could. We used to go back and a bit when I was a child. Unfortunately, it was often tragedy that brought us there. If a grandparent was ill or seemed close to death, we would. I remember when I was 5 years old, my mother was expecting her mother had fallen, and she was in a situation which seemed to be close to death, and we went over to spend a summer. We'd actually already planned to go, and then later when I was 11, I went back for some time, but it was as an adult that I started going back more frequently. Since about 2000, I try to go every few years and find different excuses to connect with family. So it's obviously with the current pandemic, it's been some time. I think the last time I was there was in gosh, I can't remember. Well, Italy in 2019, but back in Molfetta, not since I think 2017.
So that's really interesting. So, like, unlike most of us who go back and, we're discovered by some old lady walking down the street and asking who we are, they actually know who you are when you get there.
Not everyone. My cousins, my first guy, I have, on my dad's side, I have, unfortunately, since he had no siblings, I have no first cousins, but I have extended second cousins and from his and others. But on my mother's side, I have quite a few first cousins who were there, and I try to stay as connected with as possible. They're nothing but supportive and great when I visit.
Yeah, that's really great. I never knew I had anybody over there, and I just within the last few months, I actually found a second cousin. So that was very exciting for me to know that I had a second cousin over there. And my guess is, because they never mentioned it, my guess is that my father and his brothers and sisters probably didn't even know, that they had people over there.
Yeah. You'd be amazed. Like, it's interesting, even as I'm exploring DNA and connections, you figure out, it's interesting. You see that you're a second cousin once removed, and my family, both my parents who were alive, are completely unaware of who these people are sometimes, because families are so large and people move away, and it's great to be able to rediscover those connections.
So I have to guess that your family's been in that town for a very, very long time, yeah?
Hundreds of years, as far as I can tell. And we're blessed, Bob, as you well know, with the fact that digitized civil registration records from the province of Bari are some of the probably most robust that are available in digitized form. And yeah, to be able to look back and be able to confirm that your family's been in one place for a long time, it's amazing.
I know who's calling me, but I can't talk to him now.
I know it is. I made sure my phone was muted.
Yeah, well,
it always happens. Always happens. Somebody calls you when you don't want them to call you.
Yeah, it comes through on my computer now too, so it's even worse. I'm just gonna let it go to voicemail, and I'll edit this all out.
No worries.
Hi. Okay. Let's hope that we're done. There's a FaceTime call. Let me get out of this. I just killed Facebook, so hopefully it will come back. Yeah, so sorry about that. I'll edit that all out. So I have to ask, because I know a lot of people in Italy don't do genealogy or do any ancestry research like us Italian Americans are doing. Does your family know the great parents and great great grandparents? And you mentioned Antonati. So, and that surprised me with the Antonati, that Bari had so many records out there.
Yeah, we're very, very fortunate. And in my family, when I started, my grandmother was still, well, I really, at a very early age, I was always fascinated by, which kind of leads us to part of the story that we're to talk about today. But ever since I was really little, I just loved to hear the stories from the various relatives about people who, their parents, grandparents, etc. And so, like everyone else, you kind of start with that basic information of at least knowing who my great grandparents were. I mean, that's my mother would often tell stories about her grandmother, Maria Antonia Petruzzella, who lived with her in old age, and all her little sayings and things. And I was able to gather bits and pieces of information, which was useful later on when I started digging a little bit more. So not everybody may have known beyond beyond great grandparents, but it was a great place to start.
Yeah, that's awesome to be able to hear those stories, and it just dawned on me, and I guess it wasn't uh, an Italian thing that she translated, but I always remember my grandmother telling us when we were little kids. Once upon a time, the rooster found a dime. Chicken found a dime. She showed it to the rooster, and the rooster said, "It's mine." I don't know where that comes from, but when we were talking about grandma, that just popped in my head as one of those things that you never forget from when you were a little kid, you know?
And yeah, and it's little things. It's amazing. Little things. Like I remember my grandmother talking about how her grandfather had an earring, and it was interesting how little bits and pieces of information. I don't even know why. I mean, I think there was actually practical reasons in some instances where they had certain things, but it's little things kind of just stick in your head. And you mentioned something earlier about the interest. You know, here we're having maybe more interest. I think that's changing in a way, to a degree. In Italy, I'm getting a lot more interest and connections from Italians reaching out to me on Ancestry and even social media, where they discover information that I've posted, and but I definitely sense that oftentimes there's a skepticism when it comes to the documentation that's available. I'll give you an example. I remember when the information started becoming more available on Antenati. I remember I was in Italy with my cousin's friend, and we started talking about it. I was like, "Oh yeah, these records are available." And what was fascinating for me was his reaction, which was, "Are they for real?" You know, basically this assumption that they were somehow fake or fraudulent. You know, and the skepticism, I think, is something often that is confronted when it comes to this information when it becomes readily available.
Yeah, and you know, you're right, and that's how I found my grandmother's family, Pirmalo. My fourth cousin started a group, and you know, after I guess we were talking for years, and she never expected to find anybody in America. She thought she might find people in Spain because that's where the family originated from, or South America. And when I contacted her, she was shocked because she had no idea that people had come to America, and in fact, there were only two. But I know what you mean about the records, because you know, my grandmother's family, when I contact some of them that I know I'm related to, because I have the record, I have my great grandmother and know who her parents are, and they're like, "But you're American."
Yeah, it's interesting, the different types of reactions that you confront in this, and you've touched on in past podcasts even the thing that there are those in our family who when they hear about the research we're doing, they're some of them are very, very interested. Some of them are like, why are you bothering with this? Or how do you must have a lot of free time, kind of thing. And everybody's reactions are different. But it is like you've often said, I've heard you say, it is a calling. There's certain people in families that have that calling to try to be the scribe, to try to be the record keeper for those. I mean, that's what drew me into genealogy. Even though throughout my life I'd had an interest in history and family history, it wasn't until about 12 dozen or so years ago when I found myself at an age where my grandfather had died in my early 30s, and I found myself with nephews for the first time. This was before I had a child of my own, which I do now, and I found myself just saying, "Hey, here I am. I'm the first generation here in the States. I can see my nephews moving on in their lives. I am able to provide a connection to the past. Let me try to see what I can do to foster that connection, to document what I can." Now, they may not be interested; it may go nowhere, but hopefully, my nephews, my son, or maybe their descendants will be interested, or others, actually, even extended family may be interested in what I'm discovering and sharing.
Yeah, and that's kind of brings me to, when working with Anthony on the video, on the audio tapes that he made, 40 years ago, with the immigrants that came to the 1900s and their stories, which are really, just incredible stories. But now you have a really, really fascinating story about your grandfather, who was in World War II in the Italian army. Yeah.
Yes. This was what really kind of drew me into family history research. And I think, I appreciate the opportunity to share the story today, because actually we're recording this on February 2nd. We're approaching the 78th anniversary on February 12th of the disaster, the tragedy that I'm going to be speaking about. But, as a child, my father and my grandmother, it was my paternal grandfather, would occasionally talk about my grandfather and what happened to him. And one of my earliest memories is of a framed photo that they brought over from Italy. And those of us with Southern Italian ancestry who've been to Italy, especially in the 20th century, would often go into people's homes, and you'd see little memorials to people who passed in the family. And this was one of those pictures that in Italy would have had a candle or a little light next to it in memory of him. But in America, they didn't carry on that tradition. But that framed picture is something that was always stuck in my memory. I think it was like 2 or 3 years old. And, through the years, we heard bits and pieces. And all we had knew for a very long time is that my grandfather went to war in 1940. He was in the Italian army, and he was stationed in Rhodes. And then after the armistice, after Italy surrendered in September of 1943, that he was taken prisoner by the Germans, and he just simply disappeared. For decades, that's what my grandmother and my father knew. And it really, really weighed on them. And, when it comes, like with every family that faces this kind of tragedy, there are ripple effects that imprint on their psychology, on their choices that they make in their lives. And as a child, when I would hear these stories, I couldn't help but wonder, what was the ripple effect on me? Had he not passed away, what would have happened? Would my family stayed in Italy? Would my parents have gotten married? Who knows? Would I have had uncles and aunts? Would I have first cousins on my father's side? Who knew? But the imprint on my family really resonated throughout the years. And it wasn't until the early 1970s, and I think it was around the time that my grandmother was getting documentation relating to her immigration into the United States, where the Italian, I think it was the Ministry of Defense sent my grandmother a very vague letter saying that my grandfather had died in a shipwreck off the island of Goidano, which, if you try to find the island of Goidano, good luck with that. It doesn't really exist. And that was pretty much it. And it was very vague. And my father and my grandmother, taking this information, what they simply assumed was that, okay, the Germans must have taken my father. I mean, they were familiar with other tragedies in the Greek theater after Italy surrendered, where like the Acqui division, made famous by Captain Corelli's mandolin, that book, where basically the German military just slaughtered Italian military, and they just simply assumed that they put my grandfather on a boat and blew it up. That's what the story that they had in their heads. And I think it's how they reasoned what happened. It was some kind of revenge. That's what they thought had happened to him. So they pretty much accepted that. They didn't really push it any further. But it wasn't until like early 2000s, when I was approaching 30 or so, where I found myself saying, wow, I'm close to the age and where he died. He was 32 years old, 31, 32 years old. And I said to myself, what do I got to lose? Let me try to see what I can find. The internet even at that time, in the early 2000s, had made so much more information available. Let me just kind of poke around, see what I can find. So started with what everybody starts with, just started with some Google searches with whatever information I had, which was, I had a date based on the documentation that my grandmother and my father had of February 12th, 1944, that I knew my grandfather served in Rhodes. And I just started doing some search. I ended up finding myself on all these websites I never thought in a million years I would be visiting, on shipwrecks and dives, etc. And a big turning point for me was when I came across a posting on one of these diving sites from now a good, very someone I think very highly of, Telis Savedis, whose name I'm sure I'm slaughtering, who he was a diver. He dove recreationally, and he posted some information about a wreck that was off the coast of Cape Sunin, about off the coast of Antica, in the Antica region of Greece, which is about, let's say, an hour south of Athens, roughly, by car, and was inquiring about, anybody know anything about a shipwreck that happened here? So we started communicating, started sending emails. At the time, this was even before Facebook and other social media. And what was interesting, and this is what goes to show you that you never know what can happen when you just try, and you just start poking around a little bit. You never know what's going to happen. And for those out there who faced a brick wall of some kind, I think this, if anything, I hope this story is the reminder that, you just keep trying, you never know what's going to happen. But what was serendipitous in particular is that all of a sudden, people started coming out of the woodwork, like me, who had an uncle, a grandfather, a father in some instances, even a brother, a grandfather who'd been who had a similar date that they found in their own family records, and were in the same region, in the same area. And we just started kind of creating this network of people who mainly at the time were communicating over email. Then we kind of moved into social media and created a Google group. So we just started collaborating on collecting as much information as we could amongst each other. The biggest turning point was when we started seeing bits and pieces of information about a shipwreck of a steamer called the Oria, which had been, basically was a Norwegian steamer that had been taken over by Italy initially, confiscated by Italy at the outset of the war, and then ultimately had been taken by the Germans. And this ship had been used to transport Italian prisoners of war after the armistice from Rhodes, where there was a large presence of Italian military, and they were transporting them to the mainland to be taken to work camps. And there allegedly had been some kind of shipwreck off the coast of Cape Sunin. Now, and I apologize, I know I'm probably mispronouncing many of these localities. But nothing at that time was really concrete. No information was concrete at all in terms of what happened, why it happened, where it happened. We didn't know whether this shipwreck had occurred due to maybe submarine activity. Everything was very, very unclear. We just kept at it. We kept trying. We kept poking around, and a lot of places where we poked around and inquired, we just encountered more brick walls. The Italian government at the time, the Ministry of Defense wasn't very helpful. I think there was a lot of skepticism at the time from our inquiries as to what ends we were trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, we were just looking for information. It wasn't until we made an inquiry with the International Red Cross that we were able to discover that Germany had a full report of a shipwreck that occurred on February 12th, 1944, off the coast of Greece, off the coast of an island not called Goidano, but called Petroklos. And this island is about, if you looking for landmarks in Greece. Basically, the Temple of Poseidon, the archaeological site of the Temple of Poseidon is about, I'd say, 20 minutes east of where you can see the island of Petropolis on the Greek mainland. And what was amazing about this document is it's extremely detailed in terms of what happened, but more importantly, there was a list of passengers, of the Italian prisoners of war who were being transported on that ship. And what was particularly emotional for all of us was finding the names of our family members on that list. And in my case in particular, and I think it's an example of why this information was lost for so much time, and this information was such a mystery to my family for so much time, is that my grandfather's name was slightly misspelled on the list, but it most definitely was him. And because there was no other person in the Italian military by the misspelling, it's misspelled instead of Damiano De Virgilio, Damiano De Virgilio, or something like that. But there was no De Virgilio in the whatever, at least as far as I've been able to determine, this has been in the Italian military as of that time. So we were able to learn a great deal, and what's an extremely tragic reminder is how many stories from war are lost to time due to a variety of different reasons. I'm sure many of your listeners have stories from their own families from various wars throughout history, particularly in the 20th century, where certain tragedies were just lost to time for a variety of reasons. And in this case, we have an example of one of the greatest maritime disasters of all time that hardly anyone knows of. And to kind of back up for a moment and give you more context in terms of what happened, when Italy surrendered in September 8th, 1943, there was chaos anywhere where there was Italian military at the time. I've done research on my own to discover that there were attempts made, particularly by the British military, to reach out to Italian military leaders who were in the Aegean Sea theater, and Rhodes in particular, to try to basically get them to collaborate or coordinate with the Allies as of the armistice. But attempts unfortunately failed. Germany, I think, was able to circumvent those attempts, and they basically gave Italian soldiers the choice. It's like, hey, you're either going to continue working and fighting with us, or we're going to treat you as traitors, and you are worse than prisoners. You are simply going to be used as a resource in some way, workforce in particular, if they weren't unfortunately tragically killed, murdered as in many situations, like with the Acqui division. And in my grandfather's case, and many of his compatriots, they didn't want to fight on the side of Germany at that point. I mean, we can probably dedicate an entire conversation around, the dilemma, the paradox, the dilemma of as Italian Americans, as those of Italian descent, of our experiences and the ramifications of Italy being one of the Axis powers during World War II. But I like to believe, and perhaps it's a little maybe simplistic, that as with a lot of war, especially with people who, like my grandfather, who were just farmers, he was illiterate. I don't think that they really were fighting for any particular cause as much as just simply, okay, you're telling me I need to be in the army, I will be in the army because that's what you're telling me I need to do. My family needs to survive. And I feel that they, at that point, just didn't want to fight anymore. They just wanted to go home. And so they refused, and they were taken prisoner. And as I mentioned earlier, the German military started transporting Italian prisoners of war from Rhodes to the mainland to be taken to work camps. And there were several transports that a number, I mean, I don't know how many, but many. And actually, in some cases, some ships housing prisoners of war were hit by Allied submarine torpedoes and sunk. I know of a few of the ships. The names escape me at this time, but that was probably unbeknownst to the Allies at that time that these ships weren't carrying soldiers; they were actually prisoners of war. But in the case of the Oria, which is the ship my grandfather was on, they left. There were over 4,000 prisoners of Italian prisoners of war were placed on this steamer, which was primarily used for cargo. So I can only imagine. I've only seen some pictures of the ship, and who knows what particular shape it was in at the time of the shipwreck, but it was not meant for people to be transported, as far as I can tell. They were basically locked in the hold, and they left Rhodes on February 11th, and the ship started moving north. Now, at the time, because of the submarine activity, from what we've been able to glean from the official reports, they stayed close to the coast as much as they could, because submarines were unable to go that close to the mainland due to the general shallow waters. However, this worked against the Oria for a couple different reasons. I mean, it was overloaded with human cargo, for one thing. And to make matters worse, on the night of February 12th, or actually, excuse me, at the time of the shipwreck, they were hit by a massive storm. And what occurred is that the ship, as they were navigating close to the mainland, as it was coming around Cape Sunine towards the island of Patroklos, which is right across from the Greek mainland, the ship essentially they lost control due to the storm activity, which apparently, based on some people who given some form of accounts of that, what happened, it was a major storm, and the ship basically crashed into the reef, and the ship began to break apart. And the soldiers who were locked inside, unfortunately, the majority, only a handful of people survived, and they perished. They drowned, have been, fortunately, some efforts made by those who were around at the time to document their own experiences in relation to the shipwreck. But we continue to find more information over time that comes to light in terms of people who were involved. I mean, my own experience is that in the course of my research, I've met some, and through the network of family members that I collaborate with, we've actually encountered some former POWs who were in their 90s. Unfortunately, they've passed at this point. One particular gentleman who was in his 90s when we commemorated the 70th anniversary of the shipwreck, he was supposed to be on the Oria. He was supposed to be on the ship, and for whatever reason, the Germans kept him off. But after the shipwreck, he was forced to go to the place where bodies were washing up onto the beach, and he was forced to bury the bodies there at the beach on the mainland. And to meet somebody who possibly may have handled the remains of your grandfather is something that is very, very makes the whole situation all the more tangible. But I can't even imagine what he had to endure and had to live with in terms of seeing his compatriots and under those circumstances, and also know that could have been him, one of those bodies. So for months afterwards, apparently bodies and remains were washing up on the shore, and I think the locals who were there did the best they could. I think for years afterwards, apparently, after I talked to locals there, they knew the story. They the ground in which the bodies washed up was often treated as kind of sacred ground to a certain extent by the locals. I remember we also met a woman, I apologize, I feel like I'm getting a little ahead of myself in the story, who actually said to us when we met her that her family, they sustained themselves on, some supplies, some food stuff, actually washed ashore from the shipwreck, and her family, who of course, they were being occupied at the time, Greece, by Germany, by the Axis powers, and they were grateful for what even those items that washed up that they were able to use, and they actually kept some of the containers as mementos, as in honor of those who passed. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there. So when we discovered this information, and we were, first of all, we were all blown away that this happened, that this event all tied us together, and we were able to find this information together. And then our focus shifted from that point, from trying to figure out what happened to trying to advocate for some kind of memorial, some kind of acknowledgement of this occurring, and then also to do our best to inform others who may have had family who were on the ship and never knew. I mean, all of us, my grandmother died in 1992, never having known exactly what happened to her husband. And there are so many families that, to this day don't know what happened, not sure. And, we keep coming across new people. Just in 2020, I was able to determine, going through the list, that there were actually a number of American-born Italians who were on the ship. And one in particular has family now in Chicago. And I was able to connect to them and say, I don't know. It's always awkward when you reach out to somebody randomly. You don't know. You do it with humility. You reach out and you say, hi, I know this is coming completely out of the blue, but I can see this is your uncle based on information I've seen on family trees on Ancestry. Do you know what happened to him? Because I think I know what happened to them. And it's extraordinarily rewarding and touching to be able to help people find the truth about people and their family, and give them closure, and make sense out of history. But what's most compelling to me, and I can't say this enough, is the generosity and the graciousness of the Greek people, Greek authorities. Because around the time we discovered the truth, and we also things started in motion to create some form of memorial. This is in the early 2010s. And we recall, this is at a time when Greece itself was in dire straits. There was an economic crisis. And yet, even though all that was going on, the local authorities there went out of their way to not only help us, but put the wheels in motion to create a memorial. And it was extraordinary in the sense that not only here they are during an enormous economic crisis, but at the same time, we were their occupiers. The Axis power, Italians were were part of the occupying force in Greece, and the forgiveness that they were able to show in our family, our families, and the sympathy at the same time was overwhelming, extraordinary to us. And in 2014, a monument was erected. It faces out towards the island, Petroklos, where the ship impacted. And it's along a road that one can go down towards, as one's driving towards the Temple of Poseidon and along Cape Sunion. And it's a beautiful spot, and we were able to all go there for its dedication. And we were able to meet each other, meaning all the family members, for the first time after almost a decade of communicating over email. And it was, to say it was emotional would be an understatement. because to be connected by this tragedy and having endured all of our travails and efforts in trying to discover the truth, and then to actually have tangibly a monument erected in honor of these over 4,000 Italian POWs who perished in that way was, extraordinarily cathartic and one of the most emotional experiences I've had in my life. But even more so, it was around that time the Italian government became far more involved. I think there was a switch in a number of ways. I think they began to see that this wasn't a circumstance where we were seeking some kind of reparations or something for what happened. I think that was part of the concern. It's like, what do they want? Why are they asking? What do they want from us? But we just wanted information. I think they suddenly saw that, and they became far more engaged in helping us, providing information. Many of, in terms of many of the commemorations that have occurred since then, there's been Italian government officials, even the president and the prime minister were part of some of the commemorations through the years. In 2019, we went back again for the 75th anniversary, and we were hosted at the embassy for a reception, and there was a viewing of a Greek documentary that had been done in honor of the shipwreck, which was great to see. I only wish that it was more readily available to share here in the States, but it's something I'm really proud of have been a part of. I think that we now, unfortunately, are facing some challenges. We had a website for some time dedicated to the providing information about the shipwreck, and had a wall of honor. As we discovered more family members who had been on the ship and validated, we were adding names and pictures onto this. But unfortunately, this very generous gentleman who had been doing it on his own, he didn't even have a family member who was on the ship. He was administrating this site and keeping this site. He unfortunately passed away in 2020, and we've been unfortunately unable to get access to those assets, the content that was on the site. So we're scrambling right now to determine what to do. We may face ourselves having to start from scratch in some ways, which we have to do, because there are other family members out there who don't know what happened, and this is some piece of history, much like many other pieces of history, that deserves to be remembered. And we'll do whatever we can to do that.
That is an amazing story, and I could just imagine how emotional it must have been. I went to the Arizona Memorial, and that was very emotional. I didn't even know anybody on there, but there's that I'm trying to think for the right word, but there's that certain sense of something very, very tragic yet important happened there. So I could just imagine what it must have been like to have the connection to a grandfather, not just a family member, but you're actually your grandfather.
I look forward to one day going there with my son.
Sure.
Son.
Yeah, of course.
I look forward to. He's too young right now to grasp a lot of this. He's heard me talk about it. That photo I mentioned earlier, we have it. We hang it in our home, and he knows some of the stories, but I think in time I look forward to kind of sharing the detail that is part of his legacy.
And how old was your father when this happened?
He was only 5 years old. So my father was born in 1938. My grandfather and grandmother were married in early 1938 in January, and my father was born in November. When my grandfather went off to war in 1940, he was still an infant, so my father has no memories of him. And my grandmother, stopped hearing from so apparently after he was taken prisoner, probably due to the Red Cross efforts at the time, she was still receiving some correspondence from my grandfather, even as late as January of 1944. But after that, just simply nothing. And I know, anecdotally, the impact this had on my grandmother. I mean, what's amazing, Bob, and I'm sure you see this in your own research. It's the amount of death that people had to deal with back then. I think it's something we don't really grasp as well. I mean, maybe the pandemic and things have maybe brought us a little bit closer to that, but infant mortality and disease, et cetera. But and I look at my grandmother, who she was born in 1916. She had an older brother who died. He was in the Italian equivalent of the Coast Guard and died during World War II. So when her older brother dies, she'd already lost several siblings in childhood, a few due to infant mortality. She, death was everywhere. And here she is, she's faced with the loss of her husband, like many other widows at the time. I mean, certainly she was not alone. But to not have any idea what happened, I think is something that weighed on her throughout her life. But what's amazing to me is that one of my most vivid memories of her in the early 90s was sitting with her. We were sitting in the backyard. I grew up in Hudson County here in New Jersey, and we were sitting in the yard, and I don't know why she was not the kind of woman to typically become, to be reflective, but she turned to me and she said, I've been through some hard things in my life, but you know what? I would do it all again. I would endure it all again. And that was amazing to me to hear, to consider all the tragedy that she experienced. She would have been okay experiencing it again in light of what she felt were the good parts of life. And definitely, because my father was so young, never knowing a father, that definitely left an imprint on him that resonated through the rest of my family and reverberated to the rest of my family in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, no, like I said, it's an incredible story, and certainly one that I had never heard. So for anybody who thinks or wants to find out if they may have a relative that was on that ship, where could they look?
I am going to send, it just occurred, literally in the last 24 hours, I've been in contact with others in the network. I'll share you. There's an email address, informazioneoria@gmail.com. I'll share it with you, that we've created temporarily in light of the fact that the website is currently inactive. That maybe you can post on your blog. I'm particularly myself curious about connecting with, seeing if I can find more about those Italian soldiers who were actually born in the States. There were several of them born in New York City that I've been able to do a little bit of research on, but haven't been able to determine if there's a family connected to them. But our network includes people who are in Canada and the United States, predominantly in Italy, obviously, but also all over the world, Argentina, because as you all know, Italian immigrants are everywhere. Mm-hmm. Everywhere there are family members connected to the Oria internationally as well.
And I know you had sent me a blog, so we'll put that out there, and I'll put that address out there so that anybody who either wants to know more, and I know there was also YouTube video, so I'll post that out there on a blog post so people can watch that too.
Yeah, I only hope that we had our site up and running again, timing, but we will definitely share the information that we have, and hopefully, I hope we could find others who may have had a connection. If you have any family members who may have served in the Italian military who perished on February 12th, 1944, and have some information that might resonate with our story, we'd love to hear from you, because your family members may have been on the ship.
And we'll do everything that we can to get the word out there. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time, Damian. This has been one of the most fantastic and unknown stories that I've heard so far.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you for giving us a chance to share this story, especially when we're so close to the commemorating the 78th anniversary, and really, really grateful.
Okay, well, you're quite welcome.